A bed in Bel-Air. Morning light slicks across an Oscar on a cherry wood side table, a pulse of silence. Then the camera cuts hundreds of miles away to an ivy-choked ruin in Beacon, New York, Craig House. Its turrets sag under years of weather, its windows stare blankly at the Hudson. Between these two addresses, one polished, one forsaken, unfolded the secret tragedy of Henry Fonda, a man who built a career on decency while privately negotiating despair. A man built from restraint. Henry James Fonda was born in Grand Island, Nebraska in 1905. His was a small-town boyhood of starch and structure, shaped by the Midwestern need to appear calm even when the heart was breaking. That reserve, that quiet discipline, became his signature. When he played Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath, America saw in him its conscience, a man carved out of honesty. When he stood in 12 Angry Men, his stillness was stronger than violence. He was the embodiment of principle. But principle can be a prison too. Hollywood rewarded him with fame, money, and the kind of respect few actors enjoy. By the late 1930s, he and his wife, Frances Ford Seymour, lived among the eucalyptus and canyon light of Brentwood and Bel-Air. Jane and Peter, their children, grew up behind walls high enough to keep out the world, and sometimes each other. The House of Silence. Jane later described their home on Tigertail Road as a farm, half in jest. It had the sprawl and sunshine of a studio backlot, but inside, affection was rationed. Henry loved in the way his generation did, through duty, not touch. He was present, but emotionally distant, a father who seemed to exist in grayscale while his children burned in color. Frances was the opposite. A woman of grace and nervous brilliance, she adored Henry but battled storms in her own mind. Theirs was a marriage of tenderness and volatility, one that could not survive the weight of unspoken sorrows. By the late 1940s, Frances's mental health had declined. She entered Craig House Sanitarium, an elegant psychiatric hospital in Beacon, New York. To the outside world, Craig House looked like a castle. To Frances, it became a cage. On April 14, 1950, she took her own life there. The New York papers printed it coldly, Hollywood whispered it privately. Henry flew east, stood in that darkened room, and something in him froze permanently. Today, Craig House still stands, abandoned, swallowed by ivy, its halls empty except for echoes. It is, quite literally, the abandoned estate of Henry Fonda's story, the place where his family's quiet fracture became irreversible. Children of the wound. Back in Los Angeles, the Fonda home grew quieter still. Jane was 12, Peter was 10. Their father's grief turned inward, calcifying into a stoic mask. He didn't rage or collapse, he simply withdrew. Jane has spoken of that silence all her life, the sense that love existed, but unspoken, unreachable. Peter later called his father a rock, but a rock that never warmed in the sun. Their home functioned like a set piece, perfect lines, perfect lighting, no improvisation allowed. Henry remarried several times after Frances, but each marriage seemed to orbit an emotional core he never reopened. He poured himself instead into work, into playing men of conscience, because perhaps he feared he was losing his own. The body begins to fail. In 1974, doctors implanted a pacemaker in his chest. Surgeries followed, one to remove a benign tumor, another to ease arterial blockages. The body that had carried America's moral backbone began to falter. Still, he kept working. The Cheyenne Social Club, sometimes a great notion. The Bluebird, the films of his later years carried a sense of elegy, as if he knew the clock was winding down. He rarely complained. He would say, "I've had a good run," and then quietly ask the makeup artist to cover the tremor in his hands, a daughter's gift. By the late 1970s, Jane Fonda was a star in her own right, a feminist icon, an Oscar winner, a woman as fiery as her father was cool. but between them still sat that old chasm, the decades of unsaid words. Then came On Golden Pond. Jane bought the stage play's film rights specifically for him. It was about an aging professor, Norman Thayer, brittle and brilliant, and the daughter who still longed for his approval. Henry hesitated. He hated sentimentality. But Jane insisted. "It's you and me," she said. "Let's tell the truth, even if it's pretend." Filming on Squam Lake in New Hampshire became something sacred. Henry's body was failing. Every scene required careful pacing. But on camera, the thaw between Norman and his daughter mirrored the thaw happening in real life. Katharine Hepburn, his co-star, later said, "He didn't act that love. He found it." When the movie was released in 1981, audiences wept. Critics called it his career's perfect closing act, a man famous for restraint finally letting emotion crack through. At the 1982 Oscars, On Golden Pond swept. Henry won Best Actor, but he was too weak to attend. Jane accepted the award in his place. The next morning, photographers captured him at home, frail, smiling faintly, the Oscar gleaming beside him on the Bel-Air mantel. It was a victory not on stage, but in his living room, the quietest kind of triumph, the final curtain. Henry's health collapsed that summer. Heart disease had been tightening its grip for years. Prostate cancer shadowed him too. On August 12, 1982, at 77, Henry Fonda died in Los Angeles. Some say he passed at Cedars-Sinai Hospital. Others insist it was at home in bed, sunlight on his face. The death certificate lists heart disease as the cause, cancer as concurrent, and a simple phrase under arrangements, cremated, no funeral. The man who had performed the rituals of American decency all his life chose to leave quietly. That night, Jane sat with his Oscar on her lap. "I think he knew I loved him," she said later. "I think he finally let himself believe it." What the house kept. After his death, the Bel-Air home became a kind of shrine. Shirley, his fifth wife, kept it simple. No velvet ropes, no tours, just rooms full of memory. In a desk drawer rested his Navy medals from World War II, the Bronze Star, the Presidential Unit Citation. In another, a watercolor sketch of the Pacific, painted by his own hand. Beside the window, his reading glasses lay folded atop the On Golden Pond script, its margins ticked with pencil notes. The Oscar stayed in its place by the sunlight, proof that, at the very end, art had repaired something life could not. People began to call it Henry Fonda's abandoned estate. But that's not quite true. The house was not abandoned. It was preserved, lived in quietly by Shirley and later family members. The real abandoned estate lies 3,000 miles away at Craig House, the Gothic ruin where Frances's story ended and Henry's began to harden. That estate, now choked by weeds and wind, remains the ghostly punctuation mark at the end of their marriage. 2 houses, 1 ghost. Draw a line on a map from Bel-Air to Beacon, and you trace the outline of Henry Fonda's life. On one end, glamour, sunlight, order. On the other, despair, silence, decay. Between them, a family learning, slowly, painfully, that love can outlive its mistakes. Craig House and Bel-Air mirror each other like before and after photographs. One collapsed under sorrow, the other held steady through it. Both are haunted, one by absence, one by memory. Peter Fonda would later say, "Dad didn't know how to show love, but I never doubted he felt it." That sentiment, painful, forgiving, human, is perhaps the truest inscription on Henry Fonda's unmarked emotional tombstone. The lesson left behind. In Hollywood's golden age, stars built legacies from perfection. Henry built his from imperfection, from the cracks that let the light through at the end. He gave America heroes who stood for principle, but behind those stoic eyes was a man wrestling with the very idea of connection. He left no public monument, no sprawling mausoleum, just that Oscar by a window and a family that learned through art, not conversation, that tenderness, though late, can still arrive on time. If you walk by Craig House today, the wind moves through broken windows like a whisper. And if you drive past Henry's old home in Bel-Air at dusk, you can almost imagine the same golden light he saw that last spring, resting on the statue that meant more than anyone knew. 2 houses, 2 ghosts, 1 man. Henry Fonda's legacy is not what he owned, but what he learned to surrender, the idea that love had to look strong. In the end, it was softness that saved him. And perhaps that is what he truly left behind. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below, as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.